So today I'd like to introduce my friend Jerry Lips. And Jerry is recently retired as professor of integrative biology. He's a paleontologist, and in fact he's a micropaleontologist, so he studies those little forams that we've seen pictures of, and a few of you have seen in the lab during office hours. So you might think that tiny little single-celled organisms are sort of insignificant, but in fact they have turned out to be absolutely the finest tool we have for dating rocks. They are the very best. And so Jerry is one of the world authorities in that field, but I asked him to come and talk to you about something different, and that is the field called astrobiology. You might remember I've said once or twice in the past that that big history is inherently anthropocentric. It focuses on us because it's leading through to human history. And so in big history we don't pay too much attention to what might be going on other planets or other satellites in the solar system in terms of life. But that is the field which now has more, it's been around longer, maybe 20 years or so, been longer than big history. And so people from a very wide range of fields in an interdisciplinary mode have been interested in life elsewhere in the solar system and the galaxy, in the questions about how life has originated on Earth. And I guess Jerry got feeling that maybe after spending all of his life looking at these tiny little fossils that you can barely see, maybe it was time to look at something bigger. So now he's looking at the very biggest questions of all. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Jerry Lips.
Thank you, Walter.
Thank you.
Yes, I also work on tsunamis and mega earthquakes on subduction zones, looking at microfossils. We take cores through marshes and other places, and by looking at the foraminifera and other organisms that live in there, as well as the sediment, we can tell when there was a mega earthquake, and we can tell when there was a tsunami. And along our coast, north of Cape Mendocino, where there's subduction going on, the big quakes come along every 250 or 350 years, and there's usually 2 or 3 tsunamis in there that come across from other places. So I was really excited scientifically to see another huge tsunami. We've had about 5 since the Sumatran one, mostly down around New Guinea and Sumatra, and then this one. And it is tragic, and we're still working on figuring it all out, but I sure wish I had some cores from over there before this thing. We could have maybe helped to anticipate these things. So I'm here today to talk about finding ET, extraterrestrials. And this is the biology of the solar system, essentially, that I want to tell you about today. I got interested in this stuff years and years ago when I was a little kid lying in the backyard looking at the stars. And then I worked in Antarctica for a while and saw the image on ice shelves. And I saw the images that came back from Europa of an ice-covered moon that might have life on it because it had an ocean underneath of it, underneath the ice. And I thought, I know all about that. I just spent 10 years of my life in Antarctica looking at things like the Ross Ice Shelf and what lives under it. So I was really enthusiastic about getting involved, but I had other things to do. But in about 1990, I was asked to help review a whole bunch of proposals for the new Astrobiology Institute that NASA was putting together. And as a result of reading all those proposals, I thought this would be a wonderful course to teach and a wonderful field to get involved in some research. So I did. And I want to tell you about that today. I used to teach a course here in astrobiology. Usually had about 200 students because it's that kind of course that grabs you, sort of like big history. And but this is designed especially for Walter and his geology group. And here's a cover of our favorite magazine in geology journal. And these are landslides or water-laid deposits coming down the side of a crater on Mars. And you can see that Some of these, like this one coming down here, have a whole bunch of craters in them, so we know that's old. And this one has either no or few craters, and so there's been a debate in the scientific community, astrobiology community. Does this represent water? The reason for that question is that life, as we know it, cannot exist without water. So we're looking for liquid water in our search for life in other places. Now that liquid water could be oceans or lakes, streams, or just little films around crystals where organisms can live. But water is essential to the way we work. So what is an extraterrestrial, an ET? Not that one. We're not looking for those, not yet. So are we looking for something like this? Sometimes when you see people reconstructing the astrobiology of Europa with big channels that appear to be on that moon, they put a whale or a dolphin in there. That's surely not true. How about not students, but jellyfish? Maybe there's something like jellyfish. It's kind of a primitive organism, radially symmetrical. Some of them, this one maybe, use living algae to photosynthesize. That kind of a symbiosis, we call it, is something that's very common. And then this is the group I work on, Foraminifera. This is a live one. And now we're getting down to the size range of things that we might be able to find on a planet like Mars. Microbial organisms, microscopic eukaryotes, and bacteria or archaea. Everybody knows what those three domains of life are, right? No? Well, it just has to do with the organization of the DNA into a nucleus in the eukaryotes. We're eukaryotes, and everything down to sponges are eukaryotes. And then most of the other things are single-celled eukaryotes, like foraminifera, amoeba, ciliates. Most of the parasites that you have, besides the worms, are single-celled eukaryotes. And then there's bacteria and archaea that have no organization to the DNA in terms of being enclosed in a nucleus. So that's the main difference. And these are three major branches of life distinguished by their genomes. So these are bacteria. And this is probably what we're going to find in our own universe. We've been looking at the surface of these planets now for many decades, and we haven't seen any elephants or trees or anything at all that would suggest anything large lives there. So at least that's one thing that we can take a look at. So let's talk about for a minute, where would life be in the universe? And what's in the universe? Well, mostly it's space and energy and dark matter and gas and dust and clusters of galaxies. This is an image on the background here looking at 14 billion light years roughly. So that's back near the origin of the universe. And everywhere you look in the universe, you can find the elements of life. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and all the other light elements are present everywhere in the universe. So it seems to me that with that kind of presence ubiquitously in the universe, life must be fairly common. So how common would that be? How many stars are there in the universe? Everybody wants to know this, right? So I calculated it. There's about 125 billion galaxies in the universe. That's an estimate. Could be more. And each galaxy has well over 100 billion stars in each, some maybe 400 billion. And then you take those two numbers and you multiply them together and you get 125 times 10 to the 20th stars, or there it is written out. And I didn't know what that number was called, so I Googled it. And it comes out 2.5 sextillion stars. Sextillion stars. And we know today of, for sure, 531 exoplanets. In other words, planets outside of our own solar system. So this does not include the 8 planets in our own solar system, or 9 if you want Pluto. And there are at least 1,235 candidate exoplanets. So, and this is done in our own galaxy. If we were outside of it, it would look like this, and the Earth would be there, and that's about 100,000 light years across. Now that figure of 1,200 and 531 comes from a very small part of our own galaxy. So here's the galaxy, and most of the planets there are within about 300 light years of us. And that's just this little tiny ring around that dot, which is our solar system. So there's billions and billions, 300 billion planets in our galaxy perhaps, and we just have a small look at maybe 1,700 of them so far. They're finding these planets all the time now. They've really got it down. But 300 light years is a very long distance. 186,000 miles a second is the speed of light, times all of those numbers, and you get a figure that means we'll never get there. Probably ever. Unless we go at 2 or 3 times the speed of light, and then you'll be 100 years old when you get there, if you left when you were born. This means that we're really restricted to our own solar system and pieces of stuff that come from beyond the solar system perhaps, or at least the far reaches of the solar system as comets, asteroids, which you've heard about, or meteorites. So this is our solar system. We can kick Pluto out, or I grew up with Pluto. I love Pluto. I want it in the solar system as a planet, but they want to stick it in with some of these other larger asteroids. And if you look at the solar system, it's not very habitable either in terms of life. If you get out, way out in the solar system here, actually out to Jupiter, it's just too cold. There is no liquid water. If you get inboard to Mercury and Venus, it's too hot. There's no water on those planets, except for a couple of exceptions for Mercury that I'll tell you about. And that means that the habitable zone, in other words, the place in the solar system, or any planetary system like this, where you have both liquid, vapor, and ice, liquid water, vapor, and ice, that's the habitable zone. But you need to have liquid water. Otherwise you can't have life as we know it based on carbon. So the habitable zone is the one that you would predict based on its distance from the sun or the star and its surface temperature. But there are other possibilities. For example, Jupiter's icy moons, or Titan and Enceladus of moons of Saturn that may have liquid oceans or liquid on them. So here's the choice of past or present life. We know about Earth. Mars has a likelihood, this little flower thing, a daisy, is the likelihood of life. It's possible. On Earth it's for sure, because we're here. And there's water on Mars, and there's ice on Mars. On Europa, the probability, probably Europa is the best place to look for life because there is a liquid ocean underneath its icy crust. And so that increases the possibility of life presently on Europa, the icy moon of Jupiter. And there's water. In fact, the water of Jupiter is about equal to the water in the Earth's oceans because it's deeper. And yet it's only about the size of our moon. And then Ganymede and Callisto we'll talk a little bit about, and Titan also is another possibility. So why? Well, Earth is in a habitable zone. Mars may have been in a past habitable zone where it was warmer when the sun was radiating more energy perhaps, and that means that, and there are strategies now being developed to look for fossils on Mars. So either there are fossils on Mars, we hope, or maybe there's a subterranean biota there like we have on Earth. of bacteria living down in the rocks and making a living down there. On Europa, the ocean is apparently maintained by gravity-driven heat. It's a huge gravitational attraction of Jupiter working on Europa. On Ganymede, which is the largest moon in the solar system, it's large enough to even have a little core, and maybe there's radiogenic heat on it, and on Callisto. And on Titan, there are a lot of hydrocarbons. In fact, there's lakes of hydrocarbons on Titan. Exactly how that relates to life we have yet to figure out, but people are working on all this stuff. So let's just quickly go over the history of life on Earth so that you have some idea of what was going on here. And this is about 3.5 billion years ago, so that's 1 billion plus years after the formation of the Earth. And at this time, there seems to be evidence for life. Some controversy about these bacterially built stromatolites, but other people who work on carbon isotopes think that there was life around at that time. Other people, it's not without controversy though, because other people think it's been changed a little bit. But let's say around 3.5 billion years, there were things like bacteria living on Earth. That means that you have to give it a little bit more time than that to the origin of life. So I just round it off and say 4 billion years ago is when life started. That gives you enough time to cool the Earth, to develop some oceans, and so forth. So let's say 4 billion years, but knowing that there's really no evidence for that. So here's the first 2 billion years of life on Earth. Water gets formed. Maybe life comes in at 4 billion, maybe it's up here. There are fossils recorded from 3,500 million years, or 3.5 billion, but they're questionable now. And then about a little less than, or a little more than 3 billion years ago, we have stromatolites, which are built by cyanobacteria, those bacteria that photosynthesize and build up these sort of mushroom-shaped or laminated mats on the seafloor. And then apparently eukaryotes formed around, or appeared around 2.7 billion years ago. And then other things begin to happen, like there was a snowball Earth around 25 to 23 billion, 100 million years ago. Oxygen a little more than 2 billion years. And then a radiation of different kinds of single-celled eukaryotes took place. Another snowball Earth, and then the first animals. This is one of the common ones that occur in what's known as the Ediacaran biota. And those are the first.
Explain what a radiation is.
Radiation is when you have a diversification, many different species appear at the same time. Usually you have, well, for example, you have a little horse coming along in the Eocene, and it radiates into many different species of horses in the later part of the Tertiary. So we call that a radiation. So this was a radiation of single-celled eukaryotes, and we have fossils from this period of time, about 1,700 million years ago. And then, as I said, the first animals appear at around 600 million years ago, and they look something like this. Kind of hard to place in living groups. In fact, we haven't been very successful at that at all. Maybe there were sponges in here, but these things seem to be special kinds of animals. But they lived for around 60 million years at least, so they were far more successful than we are. We've only been around 7 million years if you count everything back to the split between us and the other great apes. But for most of that time, we weren't really recognizable as humans. Sometimes we're not today, I admit, but nevertheless. So here's the last 500 million years, the Cambrian explosion, where trilobites and things like that, dinosaurs appeared at about 220 million years, or a little later than that. And they continued to live up until Walter wiped them out at 65 million years ago with the asteroid. And then mammals radiated, again, all kinds of things radiated, and then humans came along. So that's a quick thumbnail sketch of life on Earth. Most of it is fossil. Most of this record is buried in fossils. So fossils are a thing that we need to look for on other planets. Although it would be much more exciting to say that we have discovered aliens. Although just last week there was a report of alien bacterial fossils in a meteorite. I'll talk more about that because that has started a bunch of things. So maybe the Earth is unique. Certainly is unique in terms of these larger animals like dinosaurs and mammals and us, at least in our solar system. Let's take a quick look at why that is. We'll start with Mercury, the planet that's closest to the sun, and it looks a lot like the moon. It's cratered, and the crater counts. That's the way they tell the age of the surface. The more craters, the older it is. And this crater count gives you an age of about 4.5 billion years, which is the age of the solar system, roughly. So this has been around since the beginning of the solar system. And it's very hot on the sunny side and freezing on the other side in the shade. And it seems totally unsuitable for life. It has very little in the way of an atmosphere. However, over on some of these limbs, there are places where it looks like a watery comet hit, and there's reflectivity in the bottoms of those craters that suggests that there's ice there that may have been deposited by an icy comet.
Is Mercury in, is it called like a tidal lock? Is it one side only?
Yeah.
Okay.
I believe that's correct. So the icy comet then deposited the ice, and some people have suggested this would be a good place to look for life. There is currently a mission circling Mercury. I think it went into orbit today, or will go, maybe it's the 17th. Anyway, we should get some images back from Mercury soon. So watch the NASA sites. Let's compare the next three planets, Venus, Earth, and Mars, in terms of their atmospheres. So if you look at Venus, well, let's start with Earth because we know about that. The atmospheric pressure at sea level is 1 bar. You don't need to know what that really means because we're just going to compare it. That's 1 atmosphere, which is at sea level. Up on the mountains, it would be less. And down in the water, it's more. On Venus, at the surface, the atmospheric pressure is 90 bars, 90 times greater than Earth. And on Mars, it's about 100th, or about 100th of the atmosphere we have. So this doesn't look too good for life. This may not look too good for life either. And so let's look at the compositions. On Earth, we have less than 1% of the atmosphere's CO2, although we're working on increasing that value every single day. And of course, that will lead to global warming. And you can compare that to all the other terrestrial planets that have atmospheres. Mars is up near 96% CO2, and so is Venus. Mars cannot hold its atmosphere because it's so much smaller as a planet, but Venus does. So Venus has become a super greenhouse planet, and at the surface, the temperature is very high. I'll show you in a minute. And then you can see the other values. The one that's really significant, other than nitrogen, is oxygen. 0 oxygen on Venus, very low level on Mars. And where did that oxygen on Earth come from? Photosynthesis, life. This kind of level of oxygen could be from the photodissociation of water or perhaps some other elements or other molecules that would give rise to oxygen. But there's not a big input, it would look like, from photosynthesis. But the atmosphere is so thin because the planet can't hold it gravitationally. So let's look at Venus. Venus is the brightest object in the solar system besides the sun and the moon, and the reason for it is this cloud of CO2, which reflects light back to us as a very bright star. And when you look at the planet with radar, you get this kind of an image, and there are a lot of big, flat, squashed looking volcanoes on here. No water, no oceans, no plate tectonics. That's evident. And why is that? Pardon?
It's too warm.
It's too hot. There's not all the water's in the atmosphere, and apparently you need water to drive plate tectonics, grease it up and make it work. So plate tectonics, and also that's why our CO2 level is so low. You may have talked about this with CO2 dissolving into the ocean and then getting precipitated either inorganically or biogenetically by organisms. And we lock up our CO2 in that fashion. And then we increase it with volcanic eruptions and driving our cars. So here's one of those sort of squashed out volcanoes. You can see little lava flows, but these aren't peaky volcanoes. These are very flat, so they sort of just sag there. And why is that? Well, this is an image taken by the Russian spacecraft Venera 13, which landed on the surface of Venus, recorded the temperature as 420 degrees centigrade, and stopped working because it burned up. And you can see the surface looks like a slag heap in a place where they've been smelting ores. So we just saw this, and I just want to remind you, on Mars, the atmosphere is essentially a greenhouse atmosphere, very high in CO2, but because it's so thin, it doesn't create a greenhouse atmosphere. In fact, the surface of Mars is about minus 61 degrees C, just the opposite of Venus. So what about life on Mars? There's always been, I mean, I could spend 2 hours talking to you about all the previous thoughts about life on Mars, going back to the canals of Mars. But let me just pick up with what NASA has done. In 1976 and 77, there were 2 Viking or so missions, and one of the missions came back with this image. And I later heard from a guy named Jerry Soffin, who was the leader on the Viking thing, that one of his technicians walked in with this image and said, "Jerry, look at this thing." And I looked at that and I said, "Oh my God, it looks like a face on Mars." And sure enough, everybody thought it was a face on Mars. Guys like Jerry Soffin and geologists like Walter take a look at that thing and say, "Oh, that's just natural erosion." But if you are a conspiracy theorist, this not only is a face on Mars, much like the Sphinx, thank you, and we even have pyramids to go with it. So you see, you can tie this civilization together with life here on Earth. So either we came to Mars and built things like that, or the Martians came to Earth and maybe we're Martians. And this is the proof. And there are whole books. I started collecting them, but I can't afford to buy everything that's been written along these lines. And so, fortunately, NASA went back there with Mars Global Surveyor in 1998, and they photographed the exact same thing. Viking was at 40 meters per pixel. Mars Global Surveyor was at 4.3 meters per pixel. And there's the face on Mars. That's what it looks like in one illumination, and there's what it is in the other one. And you can see that the eyeballs are big sort of eroded valleys. The nose is some kind of a little valley there as well. And the mouth, or maybe that's the mouth. And then this is just a standard sort of buttress around that you see around many features on Mars, probably deposited either by water or wind or erosion. So I think it's no longer a big deal, but of course the conspiracy theorists think that this is all being hidden by NASA. So if you don't like the explanation you get from the scientists, it's because we're collaborating to conceal it from the public for some reason. Although I think if Walter and I were doing this, we'd probably publish those pictures and write books about it and get rich. So why would we conspire with the rest of these nerds, right? So another approach to life on Mars was taken by Dave McKay and a team that involved people from NASA. He's a NASA guy, and from Stanford and elsewhere. And they discovered this little thing in a meteorite from Mars. We know it's a meteorite from Mars because of its isotopic composition. They figured out the history, and the meteorite rock itself would have been 3.5 billion years old, so that puts it in the early part of Earth history where we had bacteria. And they tracked how long it was in space. It was out there for about 3.5 billion years, fell to Earth and relatively recently. And then they cracked it open and took this scanning electron micrograph of it. The biologist immediately pointed out that that thing is too small to even hold one DNA molecule. This is 100th the size of the smallest bacterium, so it's very small. And you need some space, unless it could be some kind of encystment thing. Bacteria sometimes encyst when conditions get bad. Well, if you look at the background of this, you see all this sort of knobby looking stuff. And I looked at this and I thought, well, this is just, all the little knobs lined up for some reason. It's probably a mineral growth. That was my interpretation originally. And it turns out that everybody else interpreted it that way except for Dave McKay, too. So I've talked to Dave about this, and he's still trying to figure out some way to support his hypothesis. So we still have no life, right? So Mars topography looks like this. They colored it very conveniently. You'll see that 0 meters or kilometers is actually taking the highest elevations and making that at 8, and the lowest elevations making it -8. You color all this blue and this yellow and red and so on, and it looks like you got oceans on Mars. But to be fair, what they should have done was start at 8, at 0 here, and gone up to 16 like that. But these are the low spots on Mars, and people have looked at these boundary areas between these colors and either side of it very carefully for shorelines. Because as the ocean here makes shorelines, an ocean there might have made a shoreline. They didn't find anything. But here is some evidence that suggests that there could have been water on Mars, and where there's water, there could be life. And these look like seeps coming down. These are the ones I showed you in the picture from Geology magazine. And then down here it looks like a big ponded area. Of course, there's no water here, although people have suggested that water occasionally flows out of these seeps. And there's some evidence from repeated imaging of these seeps at one particular spot over some time period, a couple of years. It looked like it had changed. So maybe there was some water flow. Other people say, no, just fine-grained sediment will do the same thing. Walter can explain that to you. So here's a picture of a section of Mars, and it's 300 kilometers, 186 miles wide, so it's a big area. And here's the kind of interpretation. This looks like a big flood. This is evidence for water on Mars. And here's the way it works. Maybe due to an impact of something nearby, water in the subsurface collapses and bubbles to the surface, causing a collapse structure here, and then the water runs out, carries big boulders with it, and then as it continues to run, it deposits all the heavy stuff here, and as it outflows in this direction, it's really carrying very fine-grained material and eroding the substrate. You can see it's kind of eroded a pathway in there. And then here's another collapse structure and another one, and here's the run out of those. So this seems to be best explained by water. And here's another pretty good suggestion of water. You can see that the water in this case would be going in that direction and leaving behind in the lee of these craters that have a high rim on them, and even little craters, a flume-like structure in the back. So that's more evidence for water. And then there's places like this Valles Marineris, in which you can see what look to be erosional gullies, perhaps made by water, flowing down into the bottom of what would have been perhaps a lake bed. And you can see shorelines around that lake. Look at those shorelines. And even up high, there's shorelines. You can see the same thing in Death Valley with the old lakes there, or down around the Salton Sea, where there was a big lake and it all evaporated. You can see the shoreline still today. That's the same sort of thing. And then the lake bed itself would have been a deposition of lake bed sediments. So this looks pretty good evidence for water. So taking a closer look, Pathfinder landed on Mars in 1998. Viking had done this in the 70s. Viking was a stationary lander, and its objective was to do some tests to see if they could, with nutrient broth, to see if they could stimulate the growth of bacteria or organisms on the surface of Mars. They got a iffy result. Some people, the people who planned it, said it was life. Lots of other people said no, it was an inorganic reaction that looked like life. It's never been confirmed. So Pathfinder was a mission to actually put a rover on the surface. It didn't go very far, but it went some distance, called Sojourner. And this is what it looked like, the terrain. These are all obviously ejecta blocks from a crater nearby, or maybe hundreds of kilometers away. These peaks are peaks on a crater that was way too far for this rover to get to. So it just went to a few different places. So in 2003 and 4, the European Space Agency launched Beagle 2. Who was Beagle 1? Take a guess. Yes. Beagle, actually, it was Beagle 2. In fact, if they did this properly, the English have had 7 Beagles. This one should have been Beagle 7. But most of the other Beagles have been forgotten, and these are actually now just Beagle 1, which is Darwin's boat, and Beagle 2. This lander was to come down gently, and then it had a bunch of experiments on it. These are all solar panels, but it crashed. So the US, just shortly after that, launched the Mars exploration rovers, Spirit and Opportunity, to these 2 targets on opposite sides of the planet, and this is what one looks like. And these things are still going. This was, what, 9 years ago? No, 8 years ago or so, and they're still going. Spirit has lost the use of one of its wheels. Opportunity's still going. They rest them during the Martian winter, and then when the sun comes up, they have solar panels on them and they can start operating again. They were only planned to work. Their useful life, the warranty, was only for 90 days. But they've been going on well over that time. I guess that says something about it. This shows where Pathfinder landed, Opportunity, Beagle, and Spirit. These are on, see, 180 degrees. They're on opposite sides of the planet. This one is closer to Pathfinder. The way they do this, yes?
How come they all landed so close to each other? Like, how come they planned them all to land in just this small area?
Oh, you mean with latitude?
I mean compared to the entire size of Mars, that doesn't seem like a...
This is half of the distance around Mars,
okay.
from 0 to 180. So this would be like going from London to Wake Island, or well beyond Hawaii, although we're 4 times bigger than Mars. So this is really a wide distribution. They're all land in the equatorial zone because of the landing dynamics. It's harder to land something in the high latitudes, and also it's harder to keep them alive because there's much less solar radiation. So you have to land something with a little nuclear power plant or something like that. And they've done that. So this is the way they set it up. This is the target, the Opportunity landing zone, and they hope they'll hit this ellipse, and that's many kilometers wide. And Opportunity did. They both did. Opportunity and Spirit did. But you'll notice that this ellipse is picked out because it's a nice, smooth landing spot. Terrible for geology. That's like doing geology in a parking lot at Walmart. That's not where we want to land. We want to land like over here. But these two rovers had motility, and they actually were able to get to some of these craters nearby. And I'll show you what that looked like. So here's the outcrops that Opportunity, maybe you could hit that light there. So these are the outcrops around the edge of a small crater, and they seem to be like sedimentary rocks, layered, and they were. And they had all these little, what appear to be blue in this image, so they called them blueberries, but actually they're black. They're an iron-rich, concretionary kind of mineral, and they just weather out of this outcrop and roll down to a place like that, where they were analyzed by the instruments on board these two rovers. One of the instruments was a so-called microscope. It was a 10x microscope. That's like a hand lens to a geologist, so it was a hand lens type of imaging. And then there were a bunch of other things as well. And the honest guys who ran this program called them their robotic geologists. And here's another example of that outcrop showing what we call cross-bedding. So these are probably wind or current deposited sedimentary rocks that have been weathering out and having chemical reactions going on to make these concretionary blueberries. One of the people there sent me this image and said, could this be a fossil on Mars? It looks like a crinoid. And at first glance, it sort of looks like the stem of one of these sea lilies. But if you look really carefully, you'll see that these breaks that make up the stem actually extend into the rock beyond. So that this is just a weathering phenomenon on the surface of the rock and is not a fossil. Boy, you could almost hear the agony of disappointment when I told him I wouldn't take it as a fossil. Of course, I should have, and I could have had that picture on the cover of Science magazine probably. But that may not have been right. So the conclusions: life may be present, but it would be in the subsurface. It might have been present, but it's no longer extant. That means fossils from these early water stages that I showed you the pictures of should be looked at and done with a strong paleontological sampling strategy. The other most likely place for life is in the Jupiter Galilean satellites. These are the ones named for Galileo because Galileo in 1610 was able to see these 4 satellites of Jupiter in his very primitive telescope. So they have that name, the Galilean satellites. They include Io, which is the most volcanically active place in the solar system, more volcanoes erupting than on Earth. Europa, which is about the size of our moon, and it's covered in ice. Ganymede, the largest satellite, also covered in ice. And Callisto, covered in ice. You'll notice that on these 3 planets, Callisto has a lot of craters. Therefore, that ice, surface ice, is very old, probably around the age of the solar system, around 4.5 billion plus. Ganymede has lots of impacts, and it's got slabs of ice that are dark colored and other light colored ones, and they have different crater counts, so this shows some changing activity on the surface of Ganymede. Europa, and so it's around 3 billion years old is the estimate. Europa has hardly any impact craters, although you can see 1 or 2. And when you do the crater counts in a systematic way for Europa, the surface cannot be older than about 60 million years. So it's a very young surface ice, which means that the moon has been melting its surface or somehow destroying it and then refreezing. So here it is. Here's some of the information. The crust is very dynamic. The ice is moving. It's at least 5 kilometers thick. Some people say 100. There's a lot of tidal energy. There's sunlight enough at this surface to allow photosynthesis by a very efficient photosynthesizer. And there's liquid water under the ice, so the possibility of life is very great.
Jupiter is a gaseous planet, right?
Yeah, Jupiter itself is a gaseous planet, so is Saturn.
Moons are not.
No. Io is a rocky moon that's volcanically active. All the other, there's 26 satellites of Jupiter, and most of them are just big rocks. But these three are icy. So one of the sources of energy here, since there's so much volcanic activity on Io, which flies inboard of Europa, Europa is out far enough that it might yet still be, it is very heavily influenced by the gravitational pull of Jupiter. And that's what drives the volcanoes on Io, and probably drives not only hydrothermal vents on the seafloor of Europa, but also that causes the damage to the surface ice that you can see, and I'll show you a few pictures of. So all of this bodes well for life. Some people say, well, how can life endure on these icy worlds? And are icy worlds good abodes for life? And how do they utilize it, and how does it evolve in icy worlds? On Earth, we have two icy worlds, the Arctic and the Antarctic. And so we go and look at those places. And for example, here's an Antarctic ice core that went from the surface, it's about 1 meter long, down to where the water was in contact with the ice. And this area of the core is loaded with life. Everything from bacteria to small fish live in the channels, brine channels, in the bottom of the ice. As the seawater freezes, it excludes from the crystals of water, ice, it excludes the salts, so the salts are squeezed into little channels that we call brine channels because they're salty, and then diatoms, bacteria, little fish, microscopic organisms live in that bottom ice. And things even graze on the bottom. Krill, for example, graze on the bottom upside down like that, eating this array of stuff that's hiding in that ice. Here's another example where there's stuff in not quite at the bottom of the ice here because it's refrozen up near the top. And this is a shot of surface habitats in Antarctica where there's liquid water in the summer on the top of an ice shelf at the base of the Antarctic Peninsula, King George VI ice shelf. And if you drill down through this, or if you can find a melt hole, as we did, you can collect samples on the bottom of the ocean here, and they're loaded with life. This is a place on the ice shelf where the ice begins to break up because it's going around these islands, and there are holes here, and seals pop up through those holes once in a while because they're cruising around way far back. I mean, this is 75 miles from the open ocean, and there's seals popping up through holes, and they make their way all the way back there. And when you drill down through these ice shelves, there's plenty of life. Here, for example, is a fish below the Ross Ice Shelf, 500 kilometers back from the edge of the open ocean. The Ross Ice Shelf on that Antarctic map is right there. It's about the size of Texas. If you don't like that, it's also the same size as France. So here's a fish swimming around that we hung a bag of bait on the bottom of a TV camera, lowered it down, and about 20 minutes later this fish appears. We also trapped a lot of animals there. And then we went over to a place where there's semi-permanent sea ice, and look at all the stuff that lives there. This is a picture we took as scuba divers, and the visibility here is 600 feet. I've never seen clearer water in all the diving I've done. And the reason is that there's no productivity there because of the ice cover. So the water is very clear. And these organisms are making a living in many different ways. Sometimes they're hibernating. So can any of this stuff from the bottom of the ice get to the top? Yes?
This is about a different question, but the bag of bait really kind of brings home a point for me. How do you control for false positives? I mean, you're bringing your own biota with you when you go to these places, and I think that's a question for...
We didn't bring any fish.
No.
That fish is about that long.
Right, so the fish didn't hitch a ride, but if you're out in, if we sent this probe to Europa, how
Okay.
do you kind of sterilize that such
That's a good question. And in fact, I'm on the Planetary Protection Committee, and what we do is to try to protect planets from contamination by us. And every mission goes through that committee, and we decide on exactly what kind of contamination processes will be done, either heat or chemical or radiation is another way to do it. And you try to get the bacterial count down to some acceptable level, and that's determined for each mission too, of just a few bacteria per square centimeter or so. And that is assumed to be too low to keep a population viable. And then we also protect, we're really worried about this now because they're sending a mission to Mars to set up samples to return to Earth. And so we're looking at these laboratories where they have Ebola and anthrax experiments going, so-called biosecurity level 4, which is the highest. We don't know what we might bring back from Mars. Should we just bring it back and hand the rocks out to geologists? Certainly get rid of a lot of geologists if there was some bad stuff in there. You guys would all get jobs. Or do we go the other direction and try to ensure that we would protect the Earth from whatever's there and do thorough tests on that? So yes, that's a very critical issue on planetary protection, both directions, outgoing and incoming. Let me just go back. So every once in a while, the ice can touch the bottom of the ocean, and when it does, it entraps sediment or freezes it to the bottom, and that sediment contains a lot of fossils, like this big giant sponge, perfectly preserved. And this stuff is 4,000 years old. It's been dated. And there's microscopic fossils, foraminifera in here, and a lot of other kinds of snails and clams and so forth. So sea ice has different ages, just as the ice on Europa does, and it's kind of clear. You can tell the whiter and thicker ice is old, so this is the oldest, and this is the youngest sea ice out here. And this changes through the annual cycle in the Arctic. But we can do the same on Europa. So what would the life habitats be on these icy moons of Jupiter like Europa? Well, this is where we begin thinking about, if there were organisms there, where would they live? We're not even defining what life is. We're just saying that there's something that requires resources and that lives and reproduces, and we'll call that life. Well, once it uses resources, then we can begin to divide up the habitats into at least these very broad ones. There's about 26 that we can identify. And then the question is, how do you get those habitats, like in the bottom of an ocean or on the bottom of the ice, or living in the cracks, to the surface where a lander could sample it or an imager could see it? So that becomes a problem that's a geological problem. And there's plenty of evidence on the surface of Europa of fissures going through these things with various cracks. You can actually do the age of this. For example, this one is older than that one just by cross-cutting relationships. This one is younger than that one, and it's younger than this one. So you can begin to put all this together, and you can go back about 60 million years. So here's another interesting place with broken ice and refrozen water or slush. It looks like icebergs floating around. Some of them are tipped on edge. So to me, this is the place to land a mission. Of course, that's an engineer's horror, because their landing ellipse would be like that and it would crash for sure. But that's what I want to look at right there. I don't want to land on that smooth ice. I want to land on an outcrop, like all of these outcrops. They're about 300 feet tall, some of them anyway. And here's another view of the fissures and cracks, this time with colors. These are sort of reddish-brown colors around these cracks, and it's been suggested and compared to the colors that certain kinds of bacteria have. And the idea is that these cracks are formed. There's no displacement along the cracks. It's not like a San Andreas fault that's moving. It looks like they're opening and closing like that as the tidal forces from Jupiter impact that planetary system. Every 1.6 days, Europa goes around the planet and gets stressed by 30 meters of the ice. And so it's always being stressed and probably going like that. So maybe opening, closing, squirting water up, opening, closing, squirting more, along with the bacteria. At least that's one hypothesis of a guy who studies the colors of bacteria. And there are impact craters. This would be a good place to land and look for organisms living maybe in the crater, maybe fossils in the exposed parts of that crater. So craters are very useful, not only for extinguishing dinosaurs, but for finding fossils, because they cast debris out and there's a central peak and there are cliffs around there that you can explore for this. And I say you because I'm not going to do it, because by the time they get back to Europa, I'll be dead. It's at least 50 years in the future. This is a very high image camera took this picture, and you can see big boulders and so forth, and actually here's some cliffs. That high resolution camera was burned out by the radiation of Jupiter because Europa flies in the radiation belts. If you got out of your spacecraft on Europa, you'd die in 3 minutes because the radiation load is so intense. So here's the age, again in the same way I showed you before, 7 being the oldest, 6, 5, and so on. So we could actually go in some future mission to Europa when we can march men and women around on the surface and they can sample this for us. We could say, okay, do a transect from 5 to 1 and over to 4. We'll put all that back together again, look at the fossils that are in there, this is my dream, and tell you about the evolution of life on another planet. That would be fun. So here's Titan, Saturn's moon. We'll move out one more planet. And Titan has this hydrocarbon atmosphere in blue here. And these are Cassini spacecraft pictures. And you can see the layering in the hydrocarbon haze. And as you come down through that, there was an imaging device that Cassini dropped in there. You can see what looked like shorelines, lakes, boulders of frozen hydrocarbons of some sort or another, but it also looks like maybe there was liquid. Well, hydrocarbons are us in a way, we're all hydrocarbons, so maybe there's life on Titan. We only have limited data, less than even at Europa for this one. Oh, there's been analyses of some of it. There's methane and some other ones. I don't remember them all, but nothing that you would say is life. So they mostly seem to be lighter molecules, not big complex proteins, for example. So let's just for a moment talk about how you would sample for life. And I want to introduce this meteorite thing that was done just 2 weeks ago. And then we'll talk about some of these other things as exploration things. This is the picture that was published in a journal called the Journal of Cosmology. It's an online journal. And the author, who I know quite well, thinks these are bacteria and that they were inside the rock. And he broke the rock open and now it exposes these things. To me, they look more like growth things of inorganic, could be carbon involved, but inorganically. These come from a kind of meteorite known as a carbonaceous chondrite, which they're old, but they certainly have a lot of carbon in them and other things as well. But these seem to be artifacts of either probably not even preservation in the meteoritic rock, but probably more likely in his electron microscope. But he's been pretty enthusiastic. So what about landers and penetrators? So don't believe that one. I mean, it was in the press all over the newspapers, at least in where I was at the time in Georgia. So we still haven't found any life, nowhere in the solar system or the universe except us. So how can we do that? Well, here's a couple of ideas. You send a lander to a place like Europa. You can bounce it in like they did with Pathfinder. They bounced it in on a bunch of airbags and then it unfolded and it drove away. Or you could just drop it in like a soccer ball with little portholes to run your instruments out of. Another idea is to penetrate the subsurface into the subsurface, and at Europa maybe even allow it to penetrate into the water underneath, and then this tail on it would be the radio for radio telemetry back to the satellite orbiting Europa, then back to us. And here's the so-called Europa Ocean Explorer. This is some artist's imagination based on probably an image of hydrothermal vents on Earth. Not unlikely, but this seems very unlikely, certainly to happen in any of our lifetimes. You're looking at billions and trillions of dollars to do that. How are you going to get it through the ice, even if you could get it to Europa? Well, some people have proposed a nuclear reactor and let it melt down, just like what's happening, I guess, today. And then you could lower the thing in and, but geez, this thing's going to go, and if it ever goes, in hundreds of years from now. So who knows what people will be capable of doing. This is your standard rover. It's got wheels. Probably won't work on Europa. Too slippery. So we need something else. So we have a guy over in IB, Bob Full, who studies animals and then tries to make robots based on his animal models. So I said, well, what would you do, what kind of a robot could we make for Europa? He said, oh, a Spidle. A Spidle? What's a Spidle? He says, oh, we've already designed it. It's part spider and part turtle. Spidle. And these Spidles, they can climb up, with the right little sort of claws on the thing, can climb up an icy cliff, and if it falls off, it'll just bounce around on its turtle shell. So I began to think about that, and I decided a Penguinobot is the way to go. Now, you've all seen that penguin movie, right? You know that penguins don't really walk all the time. Sometimes they lay down like this, and they scoot along by pushing themselves with their back feet and their flippers and to wherever they're going. In other words, they toboggan. Perfect thing for Europa. Here's your engine, your propulsion things, and there's the instrument panels. So that's my Penguinobot. It's patented, so not that anybody would buy one. So, nothing yet, sorry to tell you. But keep looking. This is our hope. We've got hundreds of scientists, many right here at this university doing astrobiology, some of them working on organisms that live here on Earth in what are called extreme environments, high temperature environments like the pools at Yellowstone, very cold environments like Antarctica. And there's just a wealth of opportunity for people if NASA ever gets any more money. So thank you very much.
We could either have questions, or Jerry said he had some tsunami things. Would you? We have 15 minutes. What would you think?
I
shift over and do that, Jerry.
Well, I don't. What I have is I've been at the University of Georgia for this semester in the geology department, and when I saw that, I woke up Friday morning and saw the news about the earthquake and tsunami in Japan. I thought, this is something I've been working on with my other research, and this will be not only an opportunity to tell these people in Georgia about something I haven't mentioned to them, but maybe inform them a little bit. They are not as conscious of earthquakes as we are, for example, here, and tsunamis are beyond them probably in terms of personal experience. So I ask an audience maybe this size, And probably a quarter of them have actually felt an earthquake, and otherwise none of them had any experience. I did a lecture like this once in Sweden, where the biggest earthquake ever recorded was a 3. And they had about 300 earthquakes recorded in the last couple hundred years. We get 300 earthquakes sometimes in a week here, and they're sometimes greater than 3. And Walter and I both live on different parts of the Hayward Fault, and we feel them all the time. You guys probably do too, especially if you live in certain of these dorms. I hope you have your earthquake buckets with you. So I could show you a little bit of that, if I can find that.
I just had a quick question related to that. I've noticed like this past year, there have been a lot more earthquakes around here, like small, real small, but noticeable earthquakes than in past years. Is that a good sign or a bad sign, or does it mean anything at all in terms of a large earthquake in the future?
Well, people sometimes think that having a lot of small earthquakes will sort of ease off the stress. Probably that doesn't work, because if you look at how many small earthquakes it would take to ease off the strain of a big one, it's too much. And part of the thing is people say, a magnitude 6, that sounds like it's 10 times as much energy as a magnitude 5. It doesn't work that way. The scale is factors of 30. So a 5 is 30 times stronger than a 4, and a 6 is 30 times stronger than that. So if you multiply those together, you get 1,000. So 2 magnitudes is 1,000 times bigger. So you just would have to have too many little ones to get rid of the thing.
So basically it's not really having any effect?
I doubt it.
Well, earthquakes do come in swarms at times. How you define a swarm, I guess it's when you recognize there are too many. And I kind of like to keep track of the swarming earthquakes on the Hayward Fault, since I'm afraid my house will slip down into a trough.
Well, do tell us about that.
Well, the work that we have been doing relates to this in that, as I told you, we were looking for the historical records of mega earthquakes on subduction zones, and this is a subduction zone off the northern part of the Japanese islands, Honshu here, and this earthquake took place right there. And these are all the earthquakes of different magnitudes. I think these are, there's an 8 there and an 8 there, and now we know that one was a 9 point, I heard 9.2 today, but also the USGS revised their estimate to a 9. So it's a big earthquake on a subduction zone. And these go down like that, the subduction taking place, and as that subduction takes place, it tends to flex the crust downward, and then it snaps back. And when that happens, it snaps back like it's Sumatra. The displacement was it 60 feet? I think it was 60 feet elevation over 1,500 kilometers. That's why you get the big tsunami, because you're moving a huge mass of earth very rapidly upwards, and that water just has to go somewhere because you're pushing it just like in a bathtub when you push.
Is the piece on the right being subducted, or
The piece, this is the Pacific plate. It's going underneath the Japanese island arc. So this is the trench. The subduction is taking place here. These earthquakes are on the downgoing plate, and so they have that plate doesn't just stop there or bend straight down. It goes at a slope. And these, so this occurred right there. There's Sendai, the big place that has had, this is the third big tsunami they've had in 100 years. So they should have anticipated a little bit better about the tsunami. The Japanese are very well prepared for earthquakes. I'm not sure they're so well prepared for tsunamis. In any case, this was a huge earthquake, and there's been, this is the seismicity from 1990 to 2011. And you can see that you can hardly see the island. It's a very active plate boundary here. And so all these earthquakes are also, many of them at depth are going down to the subducting Pacific plate. See, there's hardly any earthquakes out here, but when the boundary approaches and then that slab goes down, you get lots of earthquakes generated at depth. And of course that endangers all of Japan. But they know how to deal with that, we hope. So here is the felt map. If you go to the U.S. Geological Survey after an earthquake here in California, there's a thing on their earthquake page where it says, "Did you feel it?" And you can fill out a little form that is based on this kind of evidence: not felt, weak, light, moderate, all the way up to violent and extreme. And they determine that by asking questions like, did the building groan and creak? Did the pictures sway? Did stuff fall off the things? And then this is immediately plotted on the what am I thinking of? The mailing codes. What do they call them? Zip codes. Yeah, I was thinking of phones. Zip codes, and they plot them in the colors. So within 15 minutes of an earthquake here in California, all the geeks have already put that in, and I'm one of them. I always fill it out, and then you can see where the zip codes are and how they felt it. And of course, there's a relationship. I don't know what they have in the way of zip codes, maybe none in Japan, but these are reports in different colors that relate to this intensity of shaking scale. This is different than the scale that we were talking about, the magnitude of the earthquake. This is just how much do you perceive the ground shaking. So these are pretty strong up in this vicinity. These over here are down here, hardly felt at all, and that's exactly what you'd expect. And this was an immediate kind of response. I picked this off of the USGS website shortly after the earthquake, so they hadn't got many responses. I suspect that Sendai and some of these other towns around here were up in this vicinity. This is the pathway plotted before the tsunami, immediately after the tsunami. But at the time I took it off the internet, 9 hours had already gone by. And it was just approaching, by the time I gave my little talk in Georgia, it was just approaching California. And there is a YouTube video that I recommend you look at. I just saw it before I came here, of the tsunami coming through the Golden Gate and to Emeryville. You see, a tsunami anywhere in the world's oceans goes to every other place in the world. So that these tsunami lines will go around into the Indian Ocean and into the Atlantic Ocean, and they'll go up into the Gulf of Mexico and Hudson's Bay, anything that's connected, but not with a great deal of energy. Because as you leave this, the energy is dispersed in that kind of a pattern. So the tsunami in Sumatra came around like this and around like that, and the tsunami went up the coast like this, and it was 7, 8, 9, 10 inches all the way up here to Manzanillo, where it jumped up to 8 feet. And then went back down. San Francisco was 7 or 8 inches. So we have about 10 tsunamis a year, but they're only about so big, except for the one on Friday, but only at certain places. Of course, the San Andreas Fault is a lateral slip fault. It's not a subduction zone, and it doesn't displace big chunks of seafloor, so it doesn't really create tsunamis, unless it created landslides that pushed water, but never a tsunami as big as several 100-mile slab going up 30 feet, which is what they said happened here at Japan. So we don't have to worry about generating tsunamis, but we certainly have to worry about tsunamis at a distance, like the one in Japan or Sumatra. So I just explained about this. This is So here's the San Andreas Fault, goes up here to up to Cape Mendocino, and then we're back into a subduction zone that goes up to southern Canada there. And we have to worry about that one, but that's Northern California up to Washington and British Columbia, so we don't have to worry about it. But they do, and that could be a pretty vicious thing. And maybe at the same time it would set off Mount Rainier so that they wouldn't be able to run backwards because that's going off and the tsunami's coming in, the earth is shaking, and oh my God, terrible. Oh, people ask me all the time, oh, I live in terror of these earthquakes and tsunamis. So I decided to find out what we should really be living in terror of. And at this time, there was this was in 2008, 245 people, Americans, killed in tsunamis. That would be mostly in Hawaii and some in Alaska and Northern California. Earthquakes killed 3,460, 2,000 of them in the San Francisco earthquake and fire. So most of those were probably fire deaths. And they did not bother, they say, to count the Chinese. So it's probably maybe more like 5,000. Hurricanes, including Katrina, and that was not a total count at this time. Let's say 23,000 people. Terrorism during the same period from 9/11 to 9/11/2008 killed 7,731 people. That's all these are Americans, people in the towers and who went to war in Iraq. Guns kill about 28,000 people a year in this country. I just read in the newspaper today that 2,400 have been killed since the woman in Tucson was shot. That many in America, that's 34 a day. Cars kill about 45 to 50,000 people a year. That's many people a day. Secondhand smoke killed about 3 million people in this time period. So don't worry about earthquakes. So I thought, who's killing people with all these guns? Who's killing who? Turns out mostly spouses killing spouses. Or brothers killing a sister or a brother by accident. It's not a gunman on the street corner usually. And cars kill an awful lot of people. So the message from this is, if there's an earthquake, do not get in a car, drive down the freeway with your spouse. So we spent $10 billion, was it a month or a week, fighting a war, when if we could have just used $10 billion on this problem, we would have saved far more Americans than have ever been killed by terrorists or ever will be, maybe. Well, I want to show you one tsunami thing here, and then you can go. Let me just show you by jumping ahead here. This is a great let me go back. That should do it. Okay, this is the Sumatra tsunami in Christmas, day after Christmas. Let it load up here. Okay, now watch. The tsunami starts right there. That's where the earthquake took place. And it displaced 1,500 kilometers of subsurface crust upwards, about 60 feet if I remember right. And it created this huge tsunami that killed 250 million people mainly around there. So, now watch the waves. Okay, there it goes. That's about 3 hours out. It was hitting India, Sri Lanka, Here comes the Maldive Islands, which had multiple big tsunamis go right straight across them. They're all about a meter above. Okay, now it hits Africa. It begins to bend around Australia, hits Antarctica, and look at the wave reflections and bouncing around. No wonder they had multiple waves. The waves are going in all directions. Now it goes around Australia. There was a big tsunami in New Zealand. It's coming around Africa, across the South Atlantic, joining up with these waves, and then these combine and interfere with one another. The Indian Ocean is a big mess of blobbing up and down water. These waves are going up the coast smoothly, and this is 20 some odd hours after that thing. It's been a day now. And you see they go up into the Atlantic Ocean much faster. And this is where Manzanillo is, about there. Keep that in mind, San Francisco up there. And then it goes on up there. So that's an interesting video. It's a reconstruction, a model. So even this is like 2 days later, still lots of surface activity, wave activity. I guess you wouldn't call them waves anymore. Turbulent activity in the Indian Ocean, some wave action over there. So the one that went off in Japan is still going around the world today, but at much lower levels. So I started to say that the tsunami coming through the Golden Gate on YouTube, just put in Emeryville tsunami and you'll get it. It's about that high, but because it was particularly calm the day that it came through on Friday, it looks like a wave, but as somebody pointed out, only a chipmunk could surf it. Okay, thank you very much.